Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going pretty well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Well, we say this week's edition. We've had a little bit of a gap here, in particular off the back of our recent SMSF Day events, and also in respect to some of the work that we've been doing around the topic that we're going to be covering today, legacy pensions. Now, many of you will know that we've been speaking about this at length over the past few months since the government introduced some new regulations that took effect from the 7th of December 2024 that effectively allowed for the commutation of market-linked pensions and lifetime complying pensions, life expectancy pensions. But Tim, the real sticking point with these have been around those that have asset test exemption. And specifically, we've been waiting on the government to provide us with the appropriate relief that gives us the green light for the ability to commute these income streams. Now, we have been provided with that legislative instrument, but I think it's fair to say that the outcome of that document is not necessarily giving us the green light that we want just yet.
Yeah, look, let's say it's amber. So you've got to make the decision whether you put your foot down and go for it, or alternatively put your foot on the brake and slow down a little. So it's that stock standard approaching traffic light scenario, and the reality is that what we've known all along is once this power to commute came in, it was going to impact anyone that had asset test exemption, because if they utilize the powers to commute, they would 100% lose their asset test exemption. And so then the query came like, okay, what would the result be? And the clear result has always been that as has always been the case with social security benefits, is that if you didn't have the asset test exemption, then Social Security have the power to reassess your benefits, and they can do that for a period up to 5 years and impose effectively a debt of basically any amount that you were paid that you wouldn't have otherwise been entitled to because of those assets. And what we needed was that debt waiver. Now, we've got that debt waiver. So the government have released the power to the Secretary of Social Security to be able to provide a debt waiver to individuals. However, as you sort of alluded to before, that power only comes into effect, the power for the Secretary to waive debt only comes into effect once the specification, the debt waiver specification, makes its way through its 15 sitting day disallowance period, which of course is captured in a federal election. And so there are no sitting days. And so we just have to wait until that disallowance period is finished to have absolute certainty that this motion will be passed and ultimately that the Secretary can waive debts.
So that goes back to, I think the traffic light system is quite important there because, the reality is we're probably saying to people, just slow down. We don't feel as though if we tried to run that amber light, so it was marginally green, we thought it was marginally green,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether they would look to claw back in that scenario. But you might be just better at this point in time to simply stop at that light and wait for the conclusion of this disallowance period, because it is important to note we are 9 or 10 days, sitting days, through the 15 sitting day period that we need to wait on. So yes, there is an election call, government's in caretaker mode, but hopefully, that period sort of will kick along again fairly quickly thereafter, and then we can effectively drive through what are green lights and not having to worry about this, with the uncertainty, I think, that exists at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think it warrants the extra moment to spend on this explanation, and that is that we're dealing with two quite distinct legislative instruments here. So the first legislative instrument was the regulatory change that occurred in December, and that was a change to the SIS Act and the Tax Act that provided for the power to commute, and then the extension of the allocation from reserve requirements, which were associated with lifetime pensions predominantly. Now, the key issue there is that both those SIS and those tax regulations, their effective date, they come into effect from the day following the day that they're registered. So they've been in effect since the 7th of December, and they're subject to a 15-day sitting period, which a disallowance period, which means that someone could put a motion to disallow it, but the regulations are in effect until such time. The Social Security specification, the debt waiver specification, has been introduced. It was introduced about a week ago, on about the what was it, the end of let's say the last week of March, right? And the reality of that is that, unlike the SIS and tax regulations, the Secretary's powers don't come into effect until after the disallowance period. So the Secretary doesn't have the power until that 15 days is over. Now, they then subsequently would have the power to go back and waive debts that have occurred from a commutation that occurred from the introduction of the regs. But of course, the fear is, if for whatever reason the motion is disallowed, then the Secretary will never get that power, and they won't be able to backdate. So hence why we're saying put on the brakes for asset test exemption until we're absolutely certain that the power is with the Secretary.
Yeah. So the other part to this is the detail contained within this specification, because there are two classes of debts that in essence have been covered within this instrument. So one is quite clear. So the fact that we now have our SIS regulation 1.06C, and the fact that it basically says when someone commutes, the impact of that is that the loss of asset tests exemption occurs. And then naturally, under these rules, you have the ability to start a new account-based pension subject to transfer balance cap, leave it in accumulation if you're the primary beneficiary of that money, or you lump sum it out of super. The other bit that the curveball that we've referred to here is in the second part of this, that goes to the fact, well, what happens if you don't want to commute, maybe at this point in time, but we do see other changes in respect to, say, the governing rules of the fund. So can I get you to elaborate a little bit more around this specific issue and what people should be aware of?
Yeah, so this is a far more technical piece to the whole puzzle, and that is that at no point in time was the objective of these new regulations to remove the capacity for people to maintain their asset test exemption if they wanted to. So for those that wanted to keep their asset test exemption, then in theory they should be able to do so. Hence the 5-year window and a time frame for people to think about it. But by inserting the new regulations into the SIS Act, it effectively meant for all self-managed super funds that technically they became commutable, which goes against the grain of the Social Security Act. And so what that ultimately means is that in certain circumstances, and the way that this specification is worded, is if you have amended your governing rules to allow for the commutation, then that will also result in failing the Social Security requirements and potentially and loss of asset test exemption and potentially a debt being raised. And so this instrument said, if you have done that, but you haven't actually acted on your income stream, so you haven't commuted, then there's also a debt waiver provision there. Now, to take that one step further, what all of this means is that the Secretary, from a Social Security point of view, may come out and say that all these pensions will retain their asset test exemption, and that would be the clarity that everyone would love to see, but it may not actually get to that stage. And so it may just be that those that continue with their asset test exemption just will have this ongoing debt waiver associated with them as well.
Yeah, so I mean, for example, at Smarter SMSF, we've naturally done amendments to our Smarter SMSFD that enables the ability to commute under that Reg 106C that's now been included. So again, it's just making sure you understand these different nuances, and I guess those that have that asset test exemption over any of those sort of 3 income streams that we've referred to here. I guess, Tim, ultimately what this all means is there's a great amount of complexity that sits within this area, and that's really the reason why that we've built out our legacy pensions hub, and why, if people do have any questions and issues in this particular area, they can naturally get in contact with us and use that hub to work their way through some of these issues.
Absolutely, and for me, it's why it's important that trustees are engaging with both their advisor from the piece about whether they should or shouldn't commute, and then particularly with their lifetime pensions, with an actuary from a valuation point of view, and then service providers like ourselves who can help complete the process once they've made a decision to put all the necessary documents in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that we are running a webinar on Tuesday, the 29th of April, with BGL, who we do a lot of work with in respect to our documents. So if you do want to find out more about this topic, not only in respect to asset test exemption with these legacy pensions, but just an update around the way in which you can exit these types of retirement legacy products, you can join us for that webinar. But again, we do have a number of tools, calculators, information like we do with these Feeling Smarter videos to assist you to navigate your way through this fairly complex area. Tim, I guess our grey hairs show that we do have some experience when it comes to this stuff. And clearly it was an area that had interest at our SMSF Day events, as well as people typically only have one or two of these rather than 30, 40 or 50 of these. So knowing your way around these is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's it, folks. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. We look forward to you joining us for next week's edition. Have a great rest of the week. Bye for now.
See you all.